Today, we're diving into a question that starts with something simple, a price tag, but ends up all the way at the Supreme Court. It's about tariffs, sure, but what it's really about is the invisible line connecting the money in your pocket to the balance of power in Washington, D.C. So let's get right into it. On the surface, this seems like a pretty straightforward question, right? A tariff is a tax on goods coming into the country. But figuring out who actually pays for it, well, that is at the very heart of a huge economic and constitutional battle. Does that cost get passed on to you, the consumer? Or is it a tool of foreign policy, meant to make other countries play ball?
And depending on who you talk to, you get two completely different answers. One side says, look, American businesses and ultimately American consumers are the ones paying higher prices. It's a tax, plain and simple. But the other side insists that no, tariffs are a way to pressure foreign governments. And that fundamental disagreement, is it a tax or is it a foreign policy tool, is exactly how this whole thing ended up in a major showdown at the Supreme Court.
So here's our roadmap. We'll start with that core question of who pays. Then we'll jump into the Supreme Court case itself. We'll look at the president's argument for having this power, then Congress's powerful counterargument. We'll even decode a really interesting historical clue. And finally, we'll talk about what this all means for the balance of power in the U.S.
Okay, so we're shifting gears from the economy to the courtroom. How does a debate about who pays for a product turn into a case for the Supreme Court? Well, it happens when the question stops being about who pays the bill and starts being about who has the constitutional authority to write that bill in the first place. First, let's make sure we're all on the same page here. At its most basic, a tariff is a tax. It's a tax on imported goods. And this is so important, because under the U.S. Constitution, the power to create taxes belongs to Congress. Just tuck that fact away. It's going to be a big deal in a minute.
And here it is, the law at the center of this whole storm, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA for short. It's from 1977, and it gives the president some pretty broad powers to regulate international trade whenever there's a national emergency. But here's the billion-dollar question. Does the power to regulate also include the power to tax?
So let's start with the government side of the argument. They're saying that this power isn't just a small implied thing. They see it as an absolutely critical tool the president needs to handle foreign policy effectively, especially in a crisis.
And this quote right here from the government's lawyer really gets to the heart of their argument. They're saying the words regulate importation obviously include tariffs. From their point of view, a tariff isn't really a tax. It's more like a lever you pull to control the flow of goods and achieve some foreign policy goal, like responding to a national security threat.
And here's the key piece of their logic. The government claims that any money the Treasury collects from these tariffs is just a side effect. It's incidental. In fact, they argue a tariff is actually most successful when it collects $0, because that means the other country changed its behavior. So you see, it's a regulatory tool, not a money-making one.
Okay, but on the other side of this, you have a really powerful counterargument, and it's grounded in one of the oldest principles of American government, that Congress, and only Congress, controls the nation's wallet.
This quote from the challenger's lawyer just lays it out there crystal clear. They say, you can call it a regulation all you want, but if it takes money out of an American's pocket and puts it into the U.S. Treasury, it's a tax. And the Constitution couldn't be clearer on that point. The power to tax belongs to Congress, period.
So this chart really breaks down the two opposing views. For the government, a tariff is a regulatory tool, and that IEPA law is meant to give the president broad emergency powers. But for the challengers, a tariff is a tax, and IEPA was only ever meant for specific targeted sanctions, not for rewriting the entire tariff code on the fly. It is a fundamental clash between presidential power and congressional power.
Now, to figure out who's right, both sides are actually digging into the past, and they're focusing on this one single event from 1971 that's become something of a historical Rorschach test for this whole debate.
Okay, so let's walk through this timeline. Back in 1971, President Nixon used an old wartime law to slap a huge 10% tariff on pretty much all imports. A court later said that was okay under that law. Now, here's the really important part. A few years later, when Congress passed IEPA to try and limit the president's power, they actually copied and pasted language from that older law, including the exact phrase, regulate importation.
And this is where it gets tricky, because both sides look at this history and see proof for their own argument. The government says, see, Congress knew exactly how the courts interpreted regulate importation, and they used it anyway. They clearly meant to give the president that power. But the challengers fire right back saying, whoa, not so fast. The whole reason they passed IEPA was to rein in the president. Why on earth would they secretly hand over their single most important constitutional power, the power to tax?
And that really gets us to the heart of what's at stake here. This case has become about so much more than just tariffs. It's about the fundamental balance of power in our government and what can happen when a president declares a national emergency.
During the oral arguments of the court, one of the justices came up with this pretty stunning hypothetical question. They asked if the president's power under this law is as broad as the government says it is, could a future president just declare climate change a national emergency and then, on their own, impose a massive 50% tariff on all gas-powered cars?
And the answer that came back from the government's lawyer was kind of breathtaking. He said, it's very likely that that could be done. And in that one moment, the true stakes of this case were just laid bare for everyone to see. If the government wins, a president could potentially use this law to make huge, sweeping economic changes on any issue they decide is an emergency.
So at the end of the day, the Supreme Court's decision here is going to have ripples far beyond this one case. It's going to help define the real scope of a president's emergency powers. It'll redraw the line between the White House and Congress. It'll shape the future of trade policy, and it'll tell us just how much power can be given away with two little words: regulate importation.
Which brings us right back to where we started. The next time you hear about a tariff, what will you think of? Is it a sophisticated tool of foreign policy aimed at another country? Or is it simply a tax that really starts right here, at home? The Supreme Court is going to decide who has the power to impose them, but that more fundamental question, well, that's one we'll probably be debating for a long, long time.